Walking into my parents' backyard that afternoon, my nerves were already frayed before I even reached the gate. Every time I forced myself to attend one of these gatherings, I repeated the same quiet mantra in my head. Stay composed, stay detached, keep your walls up. I was 29 years old, a grown woman navigating life as a single mother to my 8-year-old daughter, Haley. Everything I did, every decision I made, centered around shielding her from the kind of childhood I had survived. My parents had a talent for making my pain sound fictional, as though I had manufactured years of suffering because all families have rough patches. But our family dynamic was never balanced. They never turned their cruelty toward my sister Rachel. She was untouchable, adored, treated from birth as though she had been born into royalty. I was the one they trained their punishments on, the one they cut down with words like it was a hobby. We showed up at that backyard barbecue because my mother had guilt-tripped me into it. She told me people were noticing how withdrawn I had become, that I was embarrassing the family by refusing to let go of what she called childhood nonsense. That phrase alone tells you everything. Years of humiliation reduced to childhood nonsense. Haley stood beside me in her pink hoodie and jeans, still wearing her dance practice clothes, buzzing with the simple expectation of burgers and cousins and an afternoon outside. She had no idea what kind of space she had just walked into. Rachel emerged from the back door dressed like she was filming a lifestyle segment, scanning Haley from head to toe with the expression of someone inspecting defective merchandise at a discount store. She smirked and said Haley still didn't look like a child anyone cared about. Haley's chin dropped toward her chest. My jaw locked. I told myself to hold it together, that this was not the place to explode, not with Haley watching. Rachel leaned closer and whispered that she genuinely doubted my daughter would ever amount to anything, that I was raising a lesser version of my already disappointing self. My mother laughed alongside her like it was the sharpest wit she'd ever witnessed. Then she added her own commentary about how the wrong choices in men produce predictable outcomes. My dad appeared behind me and offered his contribution, suggesting my current circumstances were a direct result of never being feminine enough growing up. This was their sport. They hunted psychologically, and they were practiced at it. I told Haley to walk to the edge of the yard and watch the water while I fixed her a plate. I turned away for 5 seconds. That was all it took. When I spun back around, Rachel was directly behind Haley and shoved her hard into the deep end of the pool, fully clothed. Jeans, hoodie, socks, sneakers, all of it. The sound that came out of me wasn't a normal scream. It was something primal and unrecognizable. I sprinted toward the water and watched Haley's hair spread beneath the surface like dark ink dissolving. She wasn't coming up. She was 8 years old and she was panicking and she was sinking. I moved to jump in and my father grabbed me from behind by the neck, yanking me backward and pinning me against him. He shouted into my ear to stop, that she needed to learn, that if she couldn't survive the water, she didn't deserve life. I clawed at his forearm with every bit of strength I had. My entire body was convulsing with a terror I had never felt before, not even close. Rachel stood on the deck laughing. My mother stood beside her with a drink in her hand, completely motionless. My daughter was underwater. My father's arm was crushing my throat. The edges of my vision began to blur from the collision of rage and panic and sheer animal fear. I drove my heel backward into his legs with everything I had and felt him stagger just enough to loosen his grip. I wrenched myself free and launched into the pool. Haley's eyes were open beneath the water, wide and terrified and searching for me. She was still conscious but barely holding on. I wrapped my arm around her chest and kicked until we both broke the surface. When I pulled her out and held her against me, soaking wet, coughing and gasping and shaking, I turned and looked at them. Rachel wore a smirk like she had just done something clever. My father straightened his shirt as if he had simply stepped aside for someone on a sidewalk. My mother rolled her eyes and said we were being dramatic over one dip in the pool. I pulled Haley tighter against my chest, and something inside me shifted into a place it had never been before. Something solid and irreversible. This was not a family. This was a danger. And standing there, dripping on the pool deck, holding my shivering daughter, I made a decision without hesitation. I was done surviving them. I was going to remove every point of access they had ever had, and they would not see it coming. I called 911 before another thought entered my head. My hands were still trembling, and Haley was making small coughing sounds, foam at the corner of her mouth, her hair matted flat across her face. The dispatcher was calm and gave me clear instructions to keep her warm and position her on her side. Paramedics arrived within minutes that felt stretched into something much longer. They moved with quiet, practiced competence, and the moment they took over, I felt the sharpest edge of panic begin to pull back just enough for me to breathe. They removed Haley's soaked clothing, wrapped her in blankets, monitored her oxygen and heart rate, and told me to ride with her to the emergency room for observation. I sat in the back of that ambulance with her head resting on my lap, watching her eyelids flutter like a bird trying to find steady ground. At the hospital, doctors ran a full round of tests while nurses monitored her oxygen levels with steady attention. The nurse who held Haley's hand while I completed intake paperwork had a particular expression on her face, one I recognized immediately as the look of someone who had witnessed horror dressed up as ordinary family life many times before. The emergency room physician asked precise questions. Who was present? Who had pushed her? Who had physically stopped me from intervening? I answered truthfully in short and careful sentences, the way someone speaks when they have rehearsed a confession in their own mind for years without ever being certain they would say it aloud. Staff documented the timeline, recorded statements, and photographed bruising. The hospital social worker sat with me after the medical team was finished and told me quietly that she would be making the necessary contacts to ensure my daughter's protection going forward. Police officers arrived and took formal statements. They walked the yard, photographed the pool area, and spoke with cousins who finally said clearly that they had watched Rachel shove Haley into the water and that my mother had laughed at what followed. When investigators asked about my father's statement that a child who could not survive water did not deserve life, they wrote it down word for word. On the drive back from the hospital with Haley bundled against my shoulder and finally asleep, an officer handed me a contact card and explained that a report had been filed and referred to Child Protective Services, with a caseworker expected to reach out within the following day. That call came at dawn. A woman named Maria arrived at our motel room an hour later with steady eyes and a calm, direct manner. She explained the available options without dramatizing any of them: an emergency safety plan, supervised visitation restrictions, a temporary protective order, an immediate notification to Haley's school so that no one other than me would be permitted to pick her up under any circumstances. Listening to her describe the mechanisms of formal protection as functional, enforceable systems, rather than vague promises, made something inside me slowly begin to release. And I signed every form placed in front of me. I handed over my phone containing years of saved screenshots, recorded messages, and documented insults I had stored without knowing exactly when or whether I would ever use them. Maria submitted them as evidence, called the school principal directly, and by noon, Haley had a confidential safety code embedded in her school file. Staff were formally notified. A trusted member of the school team was designated to assist with pickup protocols until the investigation reached a resolution. The bureaucracy moved around us like armor being assembled piece by piece. I requested a private meeting with the pastor of the church my parents had always used as a social platform. I gave him a factual account, no embellishment, no venom. A child had been placed in danger. There were witnesses. A father had physically prevented the mother from rescuing her own daughter from drowning. He did not take it to a public sermon. He made a private call to the ministry elders who oversaw community involvement. Within days, the volunteer roster my father had always appeared on with visible pride quietly stopped listing his name. He was removed from youth-facing roles pending review. No announcement, no confrontation, just institutions closing the doors he had walked through for years as though he owned them. I reached out to two people I genuinely trusted within my parents' social circle and asked them plainly to support one boundary: no unsupervised contact with Haley, and no events involving children until the investigation was complete. A cousin who had once laughed along with my mother at my expense sent me a text that said she hadn't known the full picture and that her own children would not be going to that house. It was a small shift, but it mattered. The social perimeter around us was tightening without any public spectacle required. My attorney, referred through a trusted friend and experienced in domestic safety cases, drafted an emergency protection letter delivered to both the police and CPS outlining the full pattern of behavior and the immediate threat it represented. I was not pursuing revenge through headlines or exposure. I was pursuing closure through legal and administrative channels: supervised contact restrictions, School protections. A documented paper trail that would make every future attempt at intimidation traceable and enforceable. My lawyer also walked me through the longer path toward ensuring Haley's permanent separation from them if I chose it. We did not move toward that overnight. We built the foundation carefully with medical records, witness statements, and documented history. Quietly, I reinforced the practical structure of our daily life. I changed phone numbers, updated the mailing address on school records, replaced the locks on our apartment. I arranged for my close friend Elena to be listed as a secondary emergency contact for Haley's extracurricular programs. I enrolled Haley in swim lessons with instructors trained in both water safety and child protection, scheduled at times my parents could never appear without advance notice triggering a response. I taught her how to float on her back and how to call for help with the clear, calm voice. The lesson was framed around her own strength rather than around what had happened to her. I also dismantled the stage my father had always performed on. He took pride in hosting backyard gatherings, in the image of himself as a generous community man with a yard full of guests and cold drinks and laughter. I called his closest friend, the one who co-organized those events, and explained simply that I could not bring Haley back to that environment given what had occurred. He told me privately that the next gathering would be held elsewhere and would be adults only. My father never knew exactly why the applause stopped showing up. He just felt the absence of it. I never contacted any media. I never crafted a public post designed to humiliate them. I used medical documentation, law enforcement, school systems, community institutions, and quiet social networks to methodically remove every channel of access and influence they had constructed over decades. The reason that approach mattered more than spectacle is straightforward. Public exposure gives people like them a stage to perform victimhood on. Removing structural access takes away the mechanisms that allowed the cruelty to function invisibly for so long. At night, I held Haley in our small motel bed and told her stories about dinosaurs who were afraid of the water but learned how to swim anyway and became the bravest ones in the whole valley. I never framed the stories around what she had experienced. I framed them around what she was capable of becoming. She began sleeping through the night in longer stretches. Her appetite returned at breakfast. She picked up her crayons and started drawing again. Watching her quietly recover while the people responsible for the harm were losing their roles and their reach felt like a form of justice that no viral moment could have delivered. A week after the incident, I returned to my parents' house for the sole purpose of collecting the remainder of Haley's belongings. I arrived with Maria beside me and a uniformed officer at the door. My mother immediately launched into her usual script the moment she saw me, telling me I was dragging things out, that I loved drama more than I loved oxygen. The officer interrupted her without raising his voice, explaining that we were there for the child's personal items and that there was nothing to negotiate. Rachel moved toward the hallway leading to Haley's room, and Maria stopped her with a single raised hand, directing her to return to the living room. Rachel actually complied. I went upstairs and packed everything that belonged to my daughter, her dolls, her sketchbook, her pajamas, her hair accessories, her backpack, every small piece of her life that had been stored in that house. When I came back downstairs, my parents were standing in the entryway with the specific look of people who have just realized that no one is coming to manage the situation in their favor. I looked directly at my father for the first time in my life without flinching, without the familiar current of fear running underneath everything. I told him clearly that he would never have access to my child again. Not supervised, not in public, not during holidays, not at school, not in any form or setting, not ever. He produced a short laugh that died before it finished leaving his mouth because at that exact moment, the officer stepped forward and handed him the emergency no-contact order that had already been approved and filed. 300 feet. All three of them, already active, already enforceable. No warning, no debate, no opportunity to argue his way out of it. That was the conclusion I had been building toward. Not a confrontation staged for maximum emotional impact. The demolition of the only leverage they had ever held over me, which was access. I walked out of that house with Haley's hand in mine, Maria on one side, the officer on the other. The expressions on their faces were not guilt. People like them do not lead with guilt. What I saw was the specific confusion of people who have just discovered that the control they assumed was permanent has been quietly and thoroughly dismantled. The front door closed behind us, and I did not look back. They had not lost an argument. They had not lost a confrontation. They had lost us completely and permanently, and the system I had built around that outcome meant there was nothing left for them to grab onto.